So Joran wanted me to give a second presentation that shifted the focus a little bit. We've had 3 presentations which have been around the question of survival, and he thought it might be useful to have something that maybe gives us a slightly different perspective on research in parapsychology. I've been presenting and publishing research in parapsychology for about 30 years, and it covers a variety of topics that maybe we can discuss in a bit more detail during the panel discussion. So my background very much was as an experimental researcher, so much of my early work was looking at experimental tests of ESP and PK, particularly using altered states, things like a dream ESP and a technique called the Ganzfeld that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a few moments. And as you might imagine, given the controversial nature of that kind of research, particularly if it generates positive results, it can attract rather a great deal of criticism from others. Some of which at the time seemed very unfair. It seemed as if criticisms were being applied to this kind of research when they weren't being applied equally to other areas of the social sciences to which they could equally have applied. And that seemed unfair, but it seems sensible actually to take a step back and reflect on the nature of criticism of parapsychology to see if there's anything we can learn from it, see if we can help us to refine our practice and to maybe refine our thinking about the outcomes and what they mean. And in a sense, this presentation kind of is a reflection of that. I've produced a few publications quite recently that I'll mention, and again, as Peter mentioned, if you're interested in any of those, you can email me too. Again, you don't need to put anything in the email. If you just say, send me your papers, I'm very happy to. So we're going to focus on the idea of the quality of skepticism. How do others see us and the research that we present? And this is really important. So this is crucial to stress at the beginning, is that criticism is to be welcomed. It's actually a very healthy feature of ordinary discourse in scientific practice, that people are able to provide those important checks and balances against confirmatory bias. The whole scientific method is underpinned by the idea that we don't want to be fooling ourselves, that we don't want to be making mistakes in the way we perceive things, how we observe them and how we interpret them. And so science in its various ways provides us with checks and balances to guard against that, so we can get as close as we can to the truth, if there is such a thing, as possible. And so it's really important, and it's difficult for our PhD students to recognise, that we actually should invite criticism so that we can actually clarify what we're thinking before we commit things to press, where things are kind of in permanent written form. So that's really important, and very often we'll see that in the various other disciplines, in psychology in particular, you'll see that there are different schools of thought tackling the same topic area, and they will differ maybe significantly on fundamental features, maybe the approach, or the way in which they conceptualise their phenomena, and they battle that dispute out empirically and through the published record. So they will conduct research that challenges the counter view and demonstrates in ways in which it might be flawed. And criticism is certainly at its best when it's prospective rather than simply retrospective, when it actually makes suggestions for better practice in the future and makes predictions about what that future research should find. If this theory is correct or closer to the truth, then we should get these outcomes, and if that theory is actually preferable, then we'll get these other outcomes. So not quite a crucial experiment, but at least to be able to discriminate between competing explanations. When it's simply retrospective to account for the data we already have, sometimes we can never really get out of that bind in that kind of a dialogue. We can never resolve those things. But there is a problem with parapsychology, which is it doesn't conform to that kind of a model. We don't have a group of empirical researchers who disagree, maybe in fundamental ways, and who are each contributing to that research database. Instead, what we have is a group of proponents, people who are conducting the research and attempting to make sense of it, and another group of people who are essentially armchair skeptics, who speculate about that work and make suggestions for how it might be explained away, but don't feel compelled to conduct their own research to test those speculations. And so, typically within that sphere, within that community, the skeptical community, you'll find that the strength of a counter-explanation is determined by its plausibility, not by any empirical evidence which has been collected in support of it, and I think that's an important thing to start with. So we have an imbalance in parapsychology that is quite rare, I think, in other social science areas.
No,
Okay.
Will these be available for us?
Yes,
Absolutely, again,
you.
yes. Yeah, so I'm going to provide these as PDFs to
Yeah.
your and then you're very welcome to have them. And again, any of the publications I talk about, do just get in touch with through your and I'm really happy to share those as well. So we really want criticism to be good. An analogy I draw is with the opposition in government. You need a strong opposition for good governance because they're the ones that bring to task the ruling party to make sure that the decisions they make are in good faith and reasonable and are challenged, they're scrutinised extremely closely. Skeptics are a good thing, despite what I might go on to say. Now, I'm going to describe the journey I've been on in terms of the databases that I've looked at of critical commentary, and just to let you have a hint of the outcome, I'm afraid it's not going to have a happy ending, this story, as to how valuable that criticism might be on the whole. However, we are going to start on a positive, and that is a really good example of healthy criticism, and this involves the Ganzfeld debate. This is from the 1980s. These original papers were published in 1985 and 1986. And in parapsychology, we're very interested in ESP, extrasensory perception. So we're very interested in situations in which people seem to be able to acquire information that goes beyond the sensory channels as we know them. So people know what somebody else is thinking, or they are able to capture an image that somebody else is looking at. Those are the kind of situations we're interested in exploring experimentally. And what we find in terms of spontaneous cases is that for people who don't claim any special ability or sensitivity, they're most likely to have their ESP experiences when they're in a mild altered state of consciousness, when they're drifting off to sleep, when they're dreaming, when they're waking up from sleep, maybe when they're meditating or just kind of dozing and looking at the fire of an evening. Those kind of things are very commonly the circumstances in which people have an ESP experience. And so we try to replicate that using various research paradigms, one of which is to have people sleep in a sleep lab. We wake them up when they're dreaming, ask them to describe their dreams, and then we let them fall back to sleep, and then we carry on through the night and see if those dreams can help us identify a target video clip that's been chosen for them. But another method that's used is called the Ganzfeld. And here we have a colleague of ours, Simon, and he's sat in a very relaxed executive armchair that can recline. You probably can't make it out very well. If you've not, have most people heard of the Ganzfeld technique? Yeah. So we've got some yeses. The guy at the back, he's heard of it apparently, but maybe some haven't. So you might not be able to make out that Simon has eye shields on. These are actually half ping pong balls, and they're placed over the eyes and taped in place. And he keeps his eyes open as a red light is shone on his face, and this produces a very diffuse red field that's formless. And in keeping your eyes open over time, you habituate to that sensory stimulus, and it encourages visual imagery. So people start to see imagery within the red light that's being created by their own imagination. And it's rather like the kind of daydreaming, kind of hypnagogic or hypnopompic imagery that people report as they're drifting off to sleep and waking up from sleep. So it's quite a powerful technique. It's used in mainstream psychology. And it encourages that kind of imagery. He's wearing headphones, and through the headphones we play white noise, which is kind of the hiss that we might hear between radio channels when we're tuning a radio. And that also is unpatterned sound, so it produces a stimulation, but there's no signal within that noise, and so people learn to habituate to it. Again, very commonly, the power of creativity means that they will tend to hear things within that white noise, even though there are no noises embedded within it. So it might be snatches of music they might hear, environmental sounds like a car engine or something, or people talking or laughing. Those are very common reports that people will give. And this seems to be a very conducive situation for people to produce imagery that can help them identify the ESP target. So the track record was relatively good in using that technique up to 1985. At that point, Ray Hyman was invited to offer a critique of parapsychology, to evaluate it in order to give a report on whether it was actually of any merit whatsoever. So he was a very vocal critic, but to his credit, he dismissed the idea that he should explore parapsychology as a whole. It's a very wide subject area, lots of different techniques and methods are used within it, And the quality within that work is very patchy. Some areas are much stronger methodologically than others, and he recognised that it would actually be unfair to simply take a broad sweep, a rather superficial sweep, of all areas of parapsychology. And so instead, he focused in on the Ganzfeld technique as a kind of a flagship area that claimed to have some of the strongest methodologies. But within that, he was also able to be comprehensive, that he was able to look at all the experiments that had been published or reported that used the Ganzfeld technique. So in that way, he wouldn't then be selective in only focusing on one or two experiments. He could look at them all systematically to see how that subfield actually operated and whether it had any merit. So those are two features that are really important that I want you to keep in mind. So we focus on the best evidence rather than some kind of straw man example of practice. And within that best evidence, we want to take a broad sample, as broad as possible, ideally to be comprehensive, and look at all the evidence that comes from there, not simply cherry picking one piece or another. Crucially, he collaborated with Charles Oniton, one of the people who introduced the Ganzfeld to parapsychology from mainstream psychology, and Oniton provided him with original copies of all of the papers that he was aware of, published and unpublished. Some were only presented as conference proceedings and things like that. So Hyman was able to engage with all of the material, and he did so in a very meticulous and detailed way. And quantitatively, he characterised those various studies along various methodological dimensions, and he looked to see whether certain methodological weaknesses were associated with better outcomes. And that could be the kind of smoking gun. So if we find that some studies are really not terribly well done, and they're the ones that get all the large effects, then clearly it may be just an artifact. It may be due to the methods people are using, not because there's a real effect here. So that was really important. In doing that, Hyman did identify that there were some issues. And these were the examples that he gave. So in some studies, he was concerned that optional stopping was going on, that researchers might have a lucky beginning in the experimental trials that they're doing, and maybe after 20 or 25 trials, things are going really well, and they've stopped collecting data, and they've reported that as if that was the plan all along. On other occasions, people might have started slowly, so things are not going very well, people are not doing better than chance, so they carry on collecting data until things recover, and they might get back to just the baseline chance level, or it might be just a little bit better than chance expectation. But because people have control, they know how things are going, and that informs when they decide to stop. That's a problem, statistically. It means the distribution that you get isn't a normally distributed sample, and so it's a real problem. He also talked about something called the file drawer effect. So this is the idea that people might be more inclined to write up their article and have it published if they have positive results. And some people who've conducted the research but find that nothing really happened and it's not terribly informative don't go to that trouble. And it's certainly true that there are file drawers in many areas of psychology. It's a big problem. It kind of underpins what's called the crisis in modern psychology at the moment. The idea that effects are quite difficult to replicate, and one of the problems might be that people fail to replicate and never report that they've had that problem. And so the picture is a bit distorted. So that's a really important issue. Researchers seem to use different ways to analyse the outcomes of their experiments, and there was scope then for maybe them to use a number of different analysis methods and then to cherry pick the one that looks best. So if you can chop up your data in different ways with different hypotheses in mind, and some of them work out and some of them don't, maybe only the ones that work out are being reported, and all the tests that you tried that didn't work out are being, again, consigned to a file drawer. So that, again, that's a real problem. Randomization in the early studies was quite varied. This is an important feature because if there's a bias in how the targets are chosen, then people might pick up on that when it comes to judging. So very typically in a situation like this, in the Ganzfeld study, we might produce some imagery, we might imagine ourselves on a boat sailing along on the sea, and then there's rough winds and the weather turns worse, that kind of thing. And then if we were simply shown the target, we might creatively see some connections between our imagery and that particular example, that target. So instead, what people do in these studies is they show people 4 alternatives: the target clip or picture and 3 decoys. And at that time, nobody knows which is which. The experimenters don't know, and certainly the participant doesn't. And they rank order those 4. They pick one out as their preferred one, and that would be a direct hit if they are able to pick out the target.
But then they also have a number 2 ranking, a number 3 and a number 4. And we know that just by chance, people should pick the target 25% of the time. And if they're doing better than that, then it starts to become interesting. And in the databases for the Ganzfeld, to bring things up to date, the hit rate is around about 34 or 36%. So it's not enormously better than 25%, but it's statistically highly significant that people should be doing as well as they are doing. So randomization is a problem if, for example, you're just shuffling the 4 alternatives and then handing them out to the participants saying, okay, which one do you think it is? Maybe in some way the bias is that the target tends to be in position 1 more often than it should be just by chance, and people might focus more on the first image that they ever look at, and there might be more scope to see similarities. Those kind of things would be a real problem. And then sensory cues. Interestingly, Sue Blackmore's PhD includes, so she's a well-known skeptic that we'll come across in a minute, and her PhD involved the Ganzfeld, and in one of her studies she had this problem in her experiment, although her findings are not significant. And this is the idea that if you've got the, maybe you've got a sender in your experiment, so you've got somebody looking at the target and trying to communicate it to the receiver, who's got the eye shields and the headphones on. Maybe in handling that target, you start to change that image in certain ways. So smudges or fingerprints, it's called the greasy fingers hypothesis in the business. And then when they come to make their judgment and they're presented with 4 images, maybe on an unconscious level they become aware of those fingerprints and that draws them to that image over the other 3. So it sounds a bit speculative, but it's a possibility, and you can code the experiments to say, well, these experiments use the same set for the sending as for the judging. Are the effect sizes bigger there than they are when you use a brand new set of alternatives where there can't be any fingerprints on any of the images? As a result of all these little things, so it's kind of a number of smoking guns, but no actual evidence that somebody's been shot, perhaps, the overall picture for Hyman was relatively negative, and he concluded that there were too many problems before these could be considered as evidence for psi. Oniton reanalysed that exact same database in an attempt to address those concerns. So he surveyed all the unpublished studies, he got in contact with all the researchers that he knew had done Ganzfeld research and asked them in turn if they knew of other people who'd done that work, and looked at the unpublished material and found that the success rate was about the same in those unpublished studies as it was in the published ones. So that is a fairly strong argument against a file draw problem. He agrees absolutely that some of the studies have statistical problems, and so he produced a uniform statistical outcome. He converted all of the studies into the same metric, and he conducted his analysis just using it. When he did that, he found that the database cumulatively was highly significant still, even when you convert everything into the one outcome. I mean, massively, again, it's at the 1,000 million to 1 against chance, that Z-score. He wasn't sure whether the shuffling was really a problem compared with random number tables in practice, but that has to be an open question, and he did challenge some of the flaw allocations. Okay. Now, why I've gone into a bit of detail about that case is because it's a really good role model for how criticism should be practiced. It's very explicit and it makes very clear predictions about what should happen if something were true. If this particular flaw has consequences, this is how we will see it in the data. And it allows others, such as Oniton, to test those speculations against real data or to do something about it in terms of future replication attempts. And that was the best thing to come out of this exchange, really, between Hyman and Oniton, is that they went on to produce a joint communique, a paper that they co-authored, and in that they agreed that something beyond chance expectation was going on, but they disagreed as to whether that could be explained in terms of methodological artifact or not. Okay? So they disagreed on the best interpretation, but there was clearly something going on that could not be explained just in terms of chance. And they also said that it couldn't be explained in terms of certain of those flaws. So it cannot reasonably be explained by selective reporting or multiple analysis. But some of the other issues still pertain, and they disagree, there's a dispute about those others. And crucially, they made recommendations for a set of standards that researchers should use from that point onwards, ways to build in extra precautions against sensory leakage, how to test and document the randomization methods that are used, what corrections to use for multiple analyses when you're reporting your data, and so on. And the expectation was that after 1986, when the joint communique was published, all researchers designing their experiments should use that as the gold standard for their methodology. And that's pretty much that's what's happened. They were helped by technological advances, but many of the original studies are what are called manual Ganzfeld studies because they relied on experimenters doing some of the bits, so randomizing the choice of the target and recording the data. From this point on, people tended to use computerized systems, and they were called automated Ganzfeld methods. And in those, the computer could be responsible for selecting targets, for recording all the data before the outcome is revealed, and so on. And I don't think that would have happened without this debate and without these criticisms coming to light. So this was a real strong example of criticism. Okay, so here are some other examples of criticism moving forwards. And the first one stays with Charles Oniton. Unfortunately, this had to be published posthumously. Chuck died rather suddenly in 1993. And this was a special issue of Scienza e Paranormale, apologies for my pronunciation, which is an Italian skeptics journal, and they had a special issue which was devoted to the current standard of evidence for parapsychology as a discipline. And for that special issue, they invited 3 prominent parapsychologists, Richard Broughton, Bob Morris and John Palmer, to write statements about where they saw the best evidence and what that best evidence suggested to them. And those 3 papers, pre-publication, were read by Sue Blackmore, and she offered a rejoinder to those. So she offered a critical commentary on those statements about the best evidence. In the same issue, there are 3 statements, again 3 articles rather, by very high-profile skeptics. So in this case, it's Jim Alcock, Ray Hyman, and James Randi, and they reviewed parapsychology from a skeptical perspective and argued for why it didn't meet the standards for science, and that the outcome should not be interpreted as a real effect. And those 3 papers were reviewed in advance by Oniton, and he published his rejoinder to those in that same issue. What's really wonderful about this Oniton article is that he didn't get bogged down in the minutiae of the arguments that the others offered. He took a step back and looked rather at the rhetorical strategies that were being used in those 3 articles. He noted, for example, that in comparison to some of the earlier criticisms of, for example, the work of J.B. Rhine, none of these 3 critics actually focused on the results themselves to say that they were just actually chance effects. That clearly there was something going on that couldn't be explained in terms of chance alone. So that's an advance, because previously people had said, well, you know, this is just down to chance, there's nothing actually going on here. The effects are so tiny that it's probably just noise. They no longer claimed in those 3 articles to have demonstrated a relationship between methodological flaws and study outcomes. So there's no linear relationship, as we saw earlier, between this kind of feature of the research people are conducting and a positive outcome. So they're kind of losing the focus a little bit with that. Instead, we get more general complaints about a lack of cumulativeness in parapsychology, so that the research is not building on previous research in a conceptual kind of way, that people are not taking earlier findings as given and then building on the assumptions of those to refine the approach in any particular way. But generally, even in making those kind of statements, they weren't able to provide examples. So they didn't engage with the actual studies to say, for example, this latest study doesn't really show any awareness of these earlier studies. And so the linkage, the sense of evolving over time is not clear. We see some rhetorical statements that start to come into these papers. One of those is 100 years of research has failed to provide convincing evidence for parapsychological phenomena. We can update that now. Very often they'll say it's 150 years. They tie this back to the founding of the SPR in 1882. And it's really good as a rhetorical tool, because a naive reader seeing that will think that that reflects a lot of human resource hours invested in research in parapsychology. When Seymour Schouten estimated, this would have been in the 1990s, that the amount of research that had been conducted in parapsychology since its beginnings actually amounts to about a summer of psychology research. So it's very little in terms of human resources specifically devoted to research. At the moment, my guess would be that there are really still only about 200 or 250 people who are professional parapsychologists who can devote any kind of significant time to this kind of research, and that's a tiny amount of time. Some of our funding comes from the BL Foundation in Porto, and they also fund neuroscience research. And it's my belief that there are more people working in, say, 3 or 4 labs that might present neuroscience research in one session at their conference than there are working in parapsychology worldwide. So it gives you a sense of the imbalance when it comes to personnel and human resources. And it's for that reason that I think that a statement like that is misleading. There's also an assumption here that the phenomena necessarily conflict with the contemporary scientific worldview, and we'll see that played out a little bit more with some other examples. So this is what Oniton found when he reflected on the state of skepticism at that time, that they weren't really particularly engaged with the specifics of individual studies, they weren't offering tailored criticisms of those designs, but instead they were offering generic comments that instilled a sense of unease or disquiet. Things aren't quite right, there's something wrong here, and I'm not really convinced or persuaded by these claims. Okay. 25 years later, I wanted to revisit the state of play for skepticism. Again, following Hyman, I wanted to take the best evidence for skepticism as my starting point and to review that comprehensively. And I focused on this particular book that was edited by Stan Krippner, who's an extremely well-known but highly regarded proponent of parapsychology, well regarded by skeptics as well, and also Harris Friedman, who's something of an outsider really. He's got a very strong reputation in transpersonal psychology, but doesn't really do much in the way of parapsychology per se. And they were able to recruit a number of people to contribute chapters to their book, Debating Psychic Experience. And again, it seems to have the same objective. So, in your own words, how would you evaluate the evidence for parapsychology? And I thought this would be really interesting because in the 25 years since Oniton had produced his analysis, a lot has happened in parapsychology. A lot of the methods that we use are very different, and the phenomena that we produce are different as well. In that time, for example, we've done an extremely large amount of psychophysiological work that what didn't exist in that earlier database. The interest in mediumship has been revived, so people are doing more systematic mediumship research than had been going on in that earlier time. Much of the remote viewing research that was classified has been declassified and has become available, so again we might expect that to feature as part of this story. There's been a smattering of work on psychic detection, for example, so there are lots of new things that would have been exciting to see how they're represented in this up-to-date review. So the people we have here are Michael Shermers at the top, then we've got Jim Alcock, Ray Hyman, Chris French and Richard Wiseman. So they each wrote their own chapters independently of the others, and in response, they're kind of interspersed in the book. They're not exactly rejoinded to each other's. We've got Dean Radin, and we've got Chris Carter, and we've got Stephen Schwartz. So they all contributed chapters to this book. So what were the skeptical chapters like here? Well, one of the main things people focused on was statistical problems in parapsychology. And to try and interpret that, it seemed as if people were looking for some kind of replication on demand. So a definitive, crucial type of experiment that any competent researcher could attempt for themselves and would have a guarantee that they would be able to produce a significant outcome. And generally there was a suspicion, a deep suspicion, about the use of meta-analysis. So the mathematical combination of a bunch of studies together, and I can understand why. So the general notion is a bundle of sticks. So if you bind together lots of sticks, that what you produce is much stronger than any single stick, and they may compensate for the weaknesses of each of these sticks, but they might also disguise fundamental weaknesses. There might be a number of ways in which effects can be produced artifactually, and it just happens that some have this problem, some have that problem, and some have this other problem, and if you combine them all together, all you're doing is getting a pile of problems. You're not actually resolving anything. So there is, I can understand that, but meta-analysis now is widely accepted as an appropriate approach, particularly again if it's used prospectively, to analyse the studies, to code them in different ways, and to see if the categories you've used give us any insight into where the effect lies, to see if it might be due to problems. So this naive expectation of replication on demand is very clearly grounded in physics and perhaps other natural sciences. The notion that a competent researcher, if they're using the right kinds of tools, will be able to generate the phenomenon that's being claimed. That's not how things work in the social sciences, and frankly, I don't think ever has. Replication in the social sciences has always been statistical. It depends on the size of the effect that you're interested in and the power of the study that you conduct. An obvious trivial example of that might be if you're doing survey work and you survey a small group of people after an election to find out which way they voted, there's going to be enormous margins of error in the estimates you come out with. If you do a number of studies, then the estimate you get will get closer to approximating the population, but there's still error variance in those different studies. And that means in practice, even with a real world effect, you can get variation in the outcomes that you get from different studies. Some will have larger than the true effect, some will be smaller, and some will settle around about the middle. But it varies quite a lot. So it's quite naive for people to expect that anybody will be able to produce that effect on demand. Hyman, for example, alludes to the idea that there are lots of effects in psychology that are replicable on demand. Well, I taught research methods in psychology for about 20 years, and we use the most robust effects that psychology has, so some standard kind of levels of processing memory effects and the Stroop effect. And I can guarantee pretty much without exception that every group class that I would say there'd be some anomalous data in there. Some people would come in good faith, having done things to the best of their ability, with data that make no sense whatsoever. Psychology has no effects, in my view, that are replicable on demand. So, and it presumes that that's common in the social sciences, and in that way then it also misrepresents the picture in parapsychology. The latest state of the evidence, if you look somewhere such as the Handbook for Parapsychology, which came out, I forget when, 2016, 2015, Carl?
The latest one with...
yeah, the Exelpad
2015.
Yeah, 2015. You'll see that actually some of the primary findings in parapsychology replicate to the degree we should expect, given the reported effect size and given the size of those studies. They conform really quite nicely, actually. It's quite impressive. One of the concerns they have is that there seem to be experimental effects. Some researchers seem to have a better track record of capturing effects than others, and this seems deeply suspicious, implying either that these researchers are incompetent or that they're fraudulent. But this ignores the fact that experimental effects are pervasive across social science research. I always forget the name of the researcher who put this together. I always get Stanford in my head. But for example, at one stage there were close to 500 experimental effect studies that were collated together in a single publication, and they demonstrated that experimental effects occur in all sorts of studies. From, for example, educational studies, where we see that students whom the teacher is told will bloom in the next year, they'll excel cognitively, and their school scores will improve as a result, actually do bloom in that year, even though they've been randomly chosen. The only thing that's changed is the information given to the teacher. Through to studies of rats running mazes, where some rats are described as being bright rats who will learn the mazes quickly, other rats are described as dull, and it'll take them much longer to learn the mazes. That prediction came true, but the rats were randomised. The only difference was the instructions given to the researchers. There's lots of evidence that experimental effects occur in lots of areas. Perhaps understandably, that tends to get brushed under the carpet because it's rather complicated in practice for researchers to get their heads around. There's an implication that skeptics have attempted lots of replications and that they've failed to produce those replications. And it turns out that those claims are either false. So a classic example of that is that for many years Randi claimed that skeptics had replicated the Rupert Sheldrake, dogs who know when their owners are coming home, many times, and when pressed repeatedly on the matter, it turned out that no such experiments had ever taken place. And on other occasions, people are mislabeled as being always proponents and never sceptical, when there are two very strong examples of people who were quite dubious about the claims of parapsychology and were persuaded by the evidence. One of those is Bob John, who was the dean of the School of Engineering at Princeton, who had no particular interest in psychokinesis until a graduate student asked him to supervise her project that looked at PK. That project produced positive results, which intrigued him enough to attempt it for himself, and his own study produced those effects. And after that point, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab was established. So he was somebody who was clearly not a believer, let's call them, when he started out. And Daryl Bem's training was as a magician, and one of the reasons why he was invited to check out the Ganzfeld lab was to see if there were ways in which a proficient magician might be able to overcome the controls that were in place and produce spurious hits. He was impressed by the conditions of those experiments to such an extent that he agreed, if the outcomes were positive, he would co-author the publication, and he did that. They co-authored a publication in Psychological Bulletin some years later. So that's a bit odd. And as I say, it's Bob Rosenthal, yeah, so those are the studies of experimental effects. So there's lots and lots of them, but people don't talk about them. Instead, they prefer, instead of engaging with the research, they tend to again prefer rhetorical ploys. So they'll issue the data, and when they do allude to it, they make remarkable errors. So my favourite one is Michael Shermer's in describing remote viewing, and he says, under controlled conditions, remote viewers have never succeeded in finding a hidden target with greater accuracy than random guessing. The occasional successes you hear about are due either to chance or suspect experimental conditions, such as when the person who subjectively assesses the remote viewer's narrative description seems to match the target and they already know the target location and its characteristics. Where when both the experimenter and the remote viewer are blinded to the target, my analysis of the literature indicates that psychic powers exist. That's utter nonsense from start to finish. There has never ever been a published remote viewing study, to my knowledge, that would have people who were not blinded to the nature of the target if they're involved in the judging stage. It's the equivalent of not washing your test tubes before you start your chemistry research. It's utter nonsense. And of course, there are a number of studies that have produced highly significant results. People like Marilyn Schlitz, working independently from the Princeton lab. So Bob John and Roger Nelson have done their remote viewing studies. And of course, we've got some of the US military studies that Jessica Utz reviewed later on. So we have a number of examples where clearly people were performing significantly better than chance expectation under those conditions. So that's a real distortion of the situation. So we have again these sweeping allusions to poor methodology, design weaknesses, but they're vague and inconsistent. And where they are nailed down a little bit more tightly, they turn out, as in that example, to be untrue. I mentioned again the non-existent failures to replicate by skeptics. And a key one, which is again, in my view, a rhetorical device, is in the comparator they offer to say, well, this is how science works, this is what we should expect in parapsychology, and the comparator is always physics. So the idea is if you want to look at how replication happens, look at these phenomena from physics. This is what we see here, and we've got an exquisite level of accuracy in the prediction and the confirmation. That's what we should expect from parapsychology. It's an unfair comparison because physics does not have to work with sentient beings who have their own expectations and intentions in relation to the project. I don't know if I mentioned previously, but one of the studies we've done on mediumship involved collecting data from a group of Italian mediums at the Arthur Findlay College, and it's really rather like herding cats. They, I think, are deeply resistant to following any instructions whatsoever, and they absolutely just wanted to do things their own way. And of course, the result of that was we didn't get any data that were at all useful from them. And it's that sense that people have their own sense of what this is about and how they should engage with it, and that clearly affects the data that you do gather and can either make it meaningful or meaningless. The next example we'll touch on quite briefly, I think we kind of alluded to this yesterday, and this is the Reber and Alcock response to an article by Edsel Cardenio. So this is quite a coup for parapsychology. Edsel Cardenio got an article published in American Psychologist, which has an enormous circulation. It's about 350,000. It's one of the primary journals that's received by practicing psychologists in the US. And it was intended to be a summary of the evidence for parapsychology. It focused only on the experimental work, and it offered a quantitative analysis and an evaluation of the best ways of explaining the effect sizes that were reported. So a key part of the study is to categorise the phenomena in different ways. So we have one paradigm that's looking at PK effects using random number generators. We have some other studies of PK effects using dice throwing. We have another area which is the remote viewing studies, and so on and so forth. And it's very carefully laid out, phenomenon by phenomenon. The statistics are there, and then an evaluation of the methodology, how rigorous that was, and whether we can account for those findings. His conclusion here, so we see the kind of phenomena he's looking at, and these are the ones that I expected, as I mentioned before, to have been in the Debating Psychic Experience book, but some of which were absent. Cardenio concludes, the evidence provides cumulative support for the reality of psi, which cannot be readily explained away by the quality of the studies, by fraud, selective reporting, experimental or analytical incompetence, or other frequent criticisms. The evidence for psi is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines, although there's no consensual understanding of them. So how did Reber and Alcock respond to this? They were allowed a rejoinder. They didn't look at the data at all. So the original core paper was all about the data. These are the findings. How can we best understand these findings? And they set that aside from the very beginning. Why did they set it to one side? Because in principle, these phenomena are impossible. So they clearly can't have occurred in the way that it's being claimed. So therefore, there must be methodological problems that as yet we haven't discovered. That's not how science works. Science doesn't work from your conclusion backwards, so you can end up with a rationale to dismiss or explain away the phenomenon. Claims made by parapsychologists cannot be true. The effects reported have no ontological status. The data have no existential value. Hence, data that suggest they can are necessarily flawed and result from weak methodology or improper data analyses or R-type 1 errors. Remember before that I talked about armchair critics who didn't feel compelled to actually analyse or test the kind of alternative explanations they're offering. This is a case in point. It would be very easy for Reber and Alcott to go back and say, for example, here's a bunch of studies over here. This is how they suffer from type 1 errors, or this is how they've used an improper data analysis. In that paper and other equivalent publications, there seems to be no requirement to actually get your hands dirty with actual data or with methodologies. You can just make these sweeping statements, and it's rather disappointing. So I and a number of people have responded to the rejoinder and pointed out these various problems. The problem with that, of course, is that the Reber and Alcott paper gets published in a very high-profile publication that's seen by very many people and is more easily indexed and searched, whereas many of the responses are in, for example, the SPR's magazine or in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and with the greatest of respect, they just don't have the same reach as those original publications. Instead, again, they prefer the same rhetorical strategies, and you might be getting a sneaking sense of déjà vu by now about the approach that's taken. They cast aspersions on the evidence as errorful or unreplicable, but they don't offer any specifics to illustrate that conclusion. Claims of evidence for psi are announced only to later fall into disregard. Theories are enunciated and later abandoned. Methodologies are introduced, found wanting, discarded and sometimes recycled. Each new procedure is introduced with claims of success, followed by failures to replicate, followed in turn by the publication of meta-analyses that are claimed to rescue the effect of interest. I just don't recognise that in any of the phenomena that Cardenio reviewed in his meta-analysis review. It just simply isn't the case. And it's really important that people illustrate and substantiate claims like that. There's a suggestion that in some way parapsychology is different from other areas of science, that it's expecting different standards for its work. Well, we do, but only if the comparator is physics or chemistry or biology. If the comparator is another area of social science, evolutionary psychology was mentioned yesterday, then I think we can certainly fight our corner very effectively. They again refer back to a single demonstration of a crucial experiment that any competent researcher can replicate. Again, it's important to note the kind of language that's used in that situation, that sense of othering. So if any competent researcher can replicate, and that doesn't happen, the implication is that the research that's been done that finds an effect is in some way de facto incompetent. It's been conducted by people who are not able to do research properly. That's the kind of thing we see. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on survival again, just to bring things full circle. This is a book called The Myth of an Afterlife, which has been very highly regarded. It's edited by Michael Martin and also Keith Augustine, who has some really, I think, important criticisms of some of the near-death experience research. He has some criticisms of the Pam Reynolds example that I think deserve serious attention, but they've co-edited this book. And I chose this for another review because partly of the blurb. It's a very long book. It's got 30 chapters, 675 pages, so there's a lot of sceptical material here to go through. And it describes itself as a strong, comprehensive and up-to-date casebook of the chief arguments against an afterlife. So I think we can reasonably presume that this will be a rejoinder to some of the research we've been talking about this weekend. So ADC research, mediumship research, end-of-life research that Peter was talking about. We should expect some kind of response here to say, well, hold on a minute, you may be over-interpreting that. Have you thought about this issue or that potential flaw? And so on. That's what we're hoping for. Now, many of the chapters are philosophical. And they offer a priori objections for any form of afterlife or for the kinds of experiences that people report. To give you a flavour of the kind of things they might mention, they would include, for example, that a disembodied personality does not have access to sensory organs. So there's no sense in which that individual can claim to be out of their body and to have seen something, or to have touched something or felt something. And that seems to me to be a category error, really, because what people are talking about is the phenomenology of their experience that they're translating into some kind of universal language that others could understand, and we have no idea what they truly mean. Do they see in the way that we might see with our eyes? And to what extent is our qualia, our subjective experience, actually truly just a function of our visual apparatus? We don't know the answers to those questions as yet. They talk about the idea of how people, when they're disembodied, seem to be able to acquire information without outside of the known sensory channels, and there's no evidence from anywhere else that that's possible. Well, of course, parapsychology is exactly concerned with cases that seem to suggest that. All instances of telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition would fall into the category of acquiring information without the use of your sensory apparatus. So these philosophers need, I think, to be aware of that kind of evidence. They seem to be susceptible to willful blindsight, and I call this the Lord Nelson defence, because famously when Nelson was captaining his own ship, but he wasn't in charge of the fleet, he received a signal to tell him to withdraw from battle because they were losing, and he held his telescope to his blind eye and said, "I see no ships," or "I see no signal," depending on the report that you believe. And they went into battle, they won a famous victory, and he was promoted and lauded. We see that in these descriptions. We see people who say, if only there was something we could see that might offer some support for this survival hypothesis, but there's nothing out there, I can't see anything out there. So they go, for example, if brain damage of various sorts left cognitive functions unscathed, or if consciousness persisted despite alterations in brain chemistry and structure, then we might have some evidence to doubt the correlation and causal connection, but we find no such violations. Well, immediately we can think of quite a number of those. So we have near-death experiences themselves. We have cases like the Pam Reynolds case, where we can be fairly confident that there's very little by way of brain activity that would be able to sustain a conscious experience. And nevertheless, Pam Reynolds reports being able to observe the operation and stages of it that astonished her own surgeon. The kind of apparatus that he used in order to cut the bone of her skull to open up to get access to her brain for the operation, occurring at a time when she was clearly supercooled and brain dead to all intents and purposes. So there are examples of this. Blind sight cases are really interesting as well. So instances in which people who have been congenitally blind and still have near-death experiences that seem to have a visual component. They're quite striking and worthy of attention. Peter briefly mentioned terminal lucidity. This is a growing area of interest. So instances in which people's brains are unable again to sustain a conscious experience. So people have a degenerative condition that means, for example, they can't recognise their family members, they can't access their life memories, and then suddenly, just before the point of death, within the last 24 or 48 hours, they suddenly become lucid again. They engage with their family members, have an opportunity to have closure and say goodbye, to reminisce about the times they've spent together, and then they die, they pass away. Fundamentally, this should be impossible given the stratum, the substrate that you have to work with. And hydrocephalus cases are quite a challenge. They're relatively rare, but there are one or two instances, certainly, that are a real challenge. So these are cases where the spaces in the brain that contain fluid and give it its kind of volume and substance, really, that because of a genetic problem, they overinflate. And in these individuals, they only have a thin veneer of brain matter, so grey and white matter. So, and nevertheless, some of those individuals who have hydrocephalus seem to be able to hold down a job, maintain family relationships to a degree that wouldn't seem to be possible given the lack of brain matter. And that fits with the kind of things that they say. You know, if you damage a brain in this way, you see this kind of an outcome. But we have people here who have fundamental and very significant damage and nevertheless have an equivalent experience to the rest of us. Only one section actually deals directly with empirical evidence for survival. So there are 4 major sections, only one of them deals with the kind of evidence that we've been discussing. But even these chapters show very little awareness of the extensive parapsychological literature, and in a couple of cases they're highly embarrassing. So let's go back to the date. So this is published in 2015, and it includes chapters on OBEs and NDEs by Sue Blackmore that were originally published in 1983 and 1984 and are reproduced essentially unchanged, as if nothing has happened in those fields since that early date. They're unwilling to grapple with the most challenging evidence and instead prefer straw man examples. So for example, when they're interested in mediumship, they focus on a couple of early studies by Gary Schwartz rather than some of the later studies which are more sophisticated and more challenging to dismiss and explain away. Descriptions of key studies often include serious errors. So the OBE chapter, for example, refers to a classic experiment by Charlie Tart in which somebody was in the laboratory, their EEG was being monitored, and they were able to go out of body during sleep, more or less at will. They stayed for 3 nights, and on 2 occasions they were able to have an out-of-body experience. On 1 occasion they weren't able to report anything, but on the other occasion, while out of body, they were able to observe a randomly generated number, I think it was a 6-digit number, and they reported that number accurately. So that's quite a challenging experience. A method is given here to explain away that outcome, that the person was cheating and simply looked by normal means. If you go back to the original study, that's clearly impossible for 2 reasons, because the layout of the space was not at all as it's described in this skeptical account, and number 2, because the person is wearing EEG apparatus because they're in a sleep lab and are not able to move around without kind of tucking their head out of the wall in a situation. Absolutely, there weren't researchers sitting with the person throughout the night, but they were being monitored continuously, kind of electronically, which is probably stronger in some ways. Okay, so to conclude then, I go back to the original conclusion of the joint communique from Hyman and Onneson. So they say, as in any other area of scientific inquiry, research in parapsychology requires continual scrutiny and criticism, absolutely. Both critics and parapsychologists want parapsychological research to be conducted according to the best possible standards. Critics can contribute to this only if their criticisms are informed, relevant and responsible. Sadly, hopefully you might agree, we've seen that the recurring theme in practice is actually to avoid familiarity with the actualities of the research, the methods used and the findings of contemporary researchers, and instead to rely on hackneyed objections relating to the impossibility of the phenomena, that people have been at this for a long time and what have they got to show for it. The extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we can talk about that maybe during the panel as a counter claim. They allude to design weaknesses, weak replicability and small effects, but don't go on to justify that. I'm with Edsel Cordenia in saying that actually the effect sizes we see in parapsychology are of the order of about 0.15 to maybe 0.35, so they are small. They're not observable to the naked eye, you need statistics to determine them, but they are comparable with the effect sizes we see across psychology in various other meta-analyses. There's variation there. There are stronger effects in more tightly controlled studies that might be done, say, in cognitive psychology, but as you shift through the kind of levels of description to the more social psychological end and the applied psychology, health psychology and counselling psychology, the effect sizes that we have in parapsychology absolutely bear comparison with those. They're not tiny, they're not peripheral, they're not insignificant. They speculate about counter-explanations, but they don't feel any obligation to actually evidence those. It's enough to throw a bit of mud at the wall and hope that some of it might stick. And as a last resort, they misrepresent actually the work to fit agendas. A case in point might be the way in which Rupert Sheldrake's work with dogs, again, has been represented by other people who've attempted to replicate it. So thank you for your attention. I'm really happy to take questions now, or maybe during the panel.